Welcome to this episode of Just a Few. My name is Patrick Antoine. As usual, I host this series of videos in which I respond to questions submitted to me. Today's question has to do with the Bible itself as a whole and not anything in particular in the Bible. And so I'll be dealing with that question about versions of the Bible. If you have a question and you would like me to provide you a response, please feel free to submit a question via email to the email address on the screen, and I will try to provide you a response as soon as possible. Let's go to today's question then. The question is, should Christians only use the King James Version of the Bible? Now, that question has been around for decades, I assume. In fact, there's an organization, I can't remember the name now, I think it's based in the United States, that dedicated itself to this King James only movement, that only the King James Version should be used and all other versions are perversions and all types of conspiracy theories and so on associated with them. And they are very, very hostile towards anybody who don't use the King James Version. I'm sure they may have had something to do with the person submitting this question. So there are many people, Christians and non-Christians, who have painted themselves into a proverbial corner by becoming convinced that only the King James Version of the Bible is an accurate rendering of the Word of God. In fact, some of them may swear by their relatives' graves that only the King James Version should be used. And in fact, they actually give you the impression that they believe that's the way God speaks. That God speaks with thee and thou and hither and thither. Some people believe that. That's when you get to heaven, that's how God is going to speak. To respond further to this question, I want to take you to a couple of passages. The book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament tells about a time when there was this revival, as it were, taking place in Jerusalem under the ministries of Nehemiah and Ezra. Let me read a few verses from Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 3 says, "Then he, Ezra, read from it," meaning from the book of the law, "in the open square that was in front of the water gate from morning until midday, before the men and women and those who could understand. And the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law." Notice who he's reading to, those who could understand. Verse 7 says, also, and he mentions the name of a number of Levites who were there with Ezra, they helped the people to understand the law, and the people stood in their place. Verse 8, so they read distinctly from the book in the law of God, and they gave the sense of the meaning and helped them to understand the reading. Finally, in that chapter, verse 13, now on the second day, the heads of the fathers' houses of all the people, with the priests and Levites, were gathered to Ezra the scribe in order to understand the words of the law. Jump over into the New Testament when Jesus gave this parable of what we call the sower and the seed, or the seed and the soils. Matthew chapter 13, I'm reading one verse there, verse 23, where Jesus was explaining to the disciples why he taught in parables and what the parable meant. Verse 23 says, "But he who received seed on the good ground is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Notice in all of those verses I just read to you there, the word understand. In the days of Nehemiah, the people had to understand the law of God, and then it produced the effect of a revival where they began to weep and so on. They had to tell them, listen, the joy of the Lord is your strength, you don't need to weep. Jesus said the only people who bear fruit are those who hear the word of God and understand it. If you don't understand the word of God, it's the same as if I'm speaking here or reading the Bible here for you in German or Greek or something. Keep in mind the Bible's original languages were not English. What we have here are translations And thankfully we do, because there are many languages in the world where the word of God has not been translated into that language. So it's a blessing to have it translated into English. So the original text was not in English. Of course, we know it's Hebrew in the Old Testament, Greek in the New. We are dependent on the work and the labors of Bible translators to provide us a translation that we could understand. The aim or the objective of the translator is to provide us, the aim is comprehension of the original text in our language. So the reader's question should be, does this version of the Bible help me to understand the meaning of the original text? That's what the translator is trying to do. Now, English is an extremely difficult language to learn. Ask anybody from another language. English is so filled with words that sound alike, spelled the same way and mean different things, and all different types of problems with English. English is also an evolving language. Words that were used 400 years ago when the King James Version was produced, and that wasn't the original version. There were other versions of English Bibles before the King James Version. Words that were used in English back then are no longer in use or may not mean the same thing that they meant back then. And that's why we need to keep updating translations to make sure that the English words that we are using to represent or translate the original language is something that is used currently, that you could understand it and it represents the original accurately. So the other English versions are necessary than the one that was translated with English that was spoken 400 years ago. So that, let me give you a couple of examples from your King James Bible. If you have a King James Bible, please bear with me so that you'll understand why this argument about King James only is so foolish. Take, for instance, 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 3. He, Saul, the king of Israel, came to the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave, and Saul went in to cover his feet. What does that mean? That he went and covered his feet. That's what the King James Version says. The New King James Version says, so he came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. Even the New King James leaves the reader wondering, what do you mean he attended to his needs? Well, covering your feet in 1611 was what they used in English to express when a person went to relieve themselves to do their numbers in the toilet. You drop your pants and you cover your feet. That's what Saul went into the cave to do. It says here in the New King James, he went to attend to his needs. Recently, or some time ago, I was coming across that a few hundred years ago, people in Northern England and in Scotland would refer to a toilet bowl as a privy pot, or if they will say a privy pot. And that's how they called it, because you went into a private place to relieve yourself, and they called the toilet bowl a privy pot. We don't use those words anymore. So a modern translation will have to accommodate that. Let's look at another passage, John chapter 16, verse 24. I remember sitting with a young lady who had finished high school and she was on her way to teachers training college, to train to become a teacher. And I was sitting with her doing a bit of discipleship. This was over 20 years ago, and doing some Bible study with her. And she had to learn to do a Bible study and memorize John 16:24. Listen to what it says in the King James. Hitherto have ye asked nothing in my name. Ask and ye shall receive, that your joy may be full. And when she had to do that Bible study, she came to me and she's saying, this is an adult person who is well educated, was about to go into training college. She said, what is hitherto? And she was very sincere. Until I showed her because that's the Bible she happened to have, the King James. Until I read it for her in the New King James, and it says, until now you have asked nothing in my name. Ask and you will receive, that your joy may be full. Which would you prefer? Hitherto? And you have to ask somebody to explain it to you what it means? The New King James presents it to you in the language that we speak today, the form of English we speak. Matthew chapter 5, verse 23, you hear people quoting this verse. Therefore, if let me read the King James. Therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother has aught against thee, and so on. What is aught? Today, if we think about the word ought means should. At least that's one of the meaning. If you ought to do something, means you should do it or must do it. Ought 400 years ago meant anything. So the New King James says, therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has, something against you, because that's what the word ought meant back then. So they use ought, but it doesn't mean the same today. Matthew chapter 19, verse 14, finally. But Jesus said, suffer little children and forbid them not to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven. That's the King James. The New King James says, but Jesus said, let the little children come to me. Let. Because in 400 years ago, the word suffer meant let. You use that word today and it doesn't mean the same. That's why we need updated versions. And you hear some people saying, well, Jesus said to suffer children. So when they see some children going through suffering around the world, they say, that's what Jesus said. No, that's not what the passage meant. So why do people swear by this King James version of the Bible as if it's God's version? One is because of fear. They're afraid, just like some people are afraid to convert to follow Christ because they think they're betraying their ancestors and their religion. Some people feel they're betraying God and the scriptures by putting aside the King James version and using another version. Some people believe in some end time conspiracy that if you use this version, these other versions, you're going to fall into the trap of the Antichrist because they have changed the Bible. Some people are afraid they're angering God by not using the King James Bible. So fear is one reason why some people think they have to read the King James alone. Others, it's because of, and I use three reasons here why people are afraid to not use other versions, and I want you to remember them by the letters FBI, the FBI, fear. The next one is beauty, the beauty of the language. Some people really want the language, the way it's written in its royal form, the majesty of standard English, and they love literature, Shakespeare, and so on. No problem if you like that. I know someone, she's in her 60s, and I do some discipleship with her, and she is an attorney. And she says she loves it because she's accustomed reading legal documents. No problem if you like the beauty of the English. There's nothing in the English language that is as beautiful as the 40th chapter of Isaiah in the King James Version. No problem with that if you like it, if you could understand it. And the I is for indifference. Some people read the King James alone because all they're interested in is reading the Bible. They're not interested in finding out what does it mean. So there's this indifference, big deal. I just read the King James, that's all. I'm not interested in any other version because they're really lazy. They don't want to study the Bible. They're just happy to just read it if they understand it or not. So I asked one question in closing. What about those people who don't speak English? What version should they use? Or is it that the King James is the Bible for every English speaker? We have a lot of Venezuelans here now. What version of the Bible are we going to tell them they have to read? Not one in a version of Spanish. So God isn't going to punish them and tell them they have to read the King James version only because you're in an English-speaking country. So let us be appreciative of all those people who have labored to provide us with different versions of the Bible in English, the translators, and we need to have new and updated versions of the Bible every so often. So the objective is not to deliberately corrupt or change the Bible, but to render it in a readable, understandable versions. My name is Patrick Antoine. It took a long time to explain that to you. If you have a King James and you want to read it, no problem. If not, there are many other versions that you could read. Thank you for the question. Until the next time, grace and peace be multiplied to you.